What's good? It's Woog. We have the return of an undefeated middleweight champion after a 2.5-year layoff. We've got Jermall Charlo, 32 wins and 0 losses, taking on Jose Benavidez Jr., 28 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. Those 2 losses for Benavidez are against Terrence Crawford in 2018 and then against Danny Garcia in 2022. And as I mentioned, Jermall Charlo's coming off a 2.5-year layoff. And when he was down at 154 several years ago, and him and his twin brother, Jermall Charlo, were doing their things at junior middleweight, I always looked at Jermall Charlo as being the slightly more talented, slightly more complete fighter. Like, obviously there were a lot of good attributes for Jermall Charlo as well. And to be fair, Jermall Charlo has ended up, as the story has played out, having the much greater legacy career-wise. But I always looked at Jermall Charlo as being a better technical boxer and arguably having more pop. Now, Jermall Charlo went up to 160, whereas Jermall Charlo stayed and became undisputed at 154. But when Jermall, the bigger brother, was at 154, he had some very good wins. I remember him knocking out Cornelius K9 Bundridge. He knocked out Julian J. Rock Williams. That was a very good knockout at the time. And Jermall Charlo beat Austin Trout. This is when Jermall Charlo held the IBF junior middleweight title. Then he went up at 160, and I remember at the time being a little bit bummed that he went up to 160 because I felt like he left a lot of meat on the bone at 154. There were some very good fighters. Now, I know that he and his brother were very cool with and often trained with Erislandy Lara, so that fight didn't look like it was likely to happen, but there was still Jarrett Hurd, who at the time was an elite 154 guy. There, of course, was Canelo Alvarez, which I had long wanted to see Jermall. I know it was Jermall who ended up getting in the ring with Canelo, but it was often Jermall that I had wanted to see fight Canelo. So it didn't happen at 154, but when he went up to 160, I was like, oh man, because there were a few 154 fights that I still wanted to see, but I was thinking, okay, maybe it happens at 160. Well, it didn't happen there either. And as good as Jermall Charlo's career was looking in that stretch at 154, it was just ultra disappointing and frustrating watching his fight-by-fight trajectory at 160. Yes, he did capture the vacant WBC belt, and he ended up defending that belt, the belt that he still holds to this day, inexplicably, given that 2.5-year layoff without defending the title. But he earned that WBC belt, defended it successfully several times, but you were looking at who was at 160, and then you were looking at who Jermall Charlo was fighting, and you're like, what's going on here? Like, can we get him in the ring against an elite opponent? Whether it's Demetrius Andrade, who was one of those 154 guys I didn't mention that I wanted to see Jermall Charlo fight at the time. But you also had Jaime Munguia, you had Triple G, you had Billy Joe Saunders. I mean, hell, there was a point where even Chris Eubank Jr. went over to PBC, and I was thinking, okay, so they're gonna line up a Jermall Charlo, Chris Eubank Jr. fight. Okay, cool. Well, that didn't happen either. Instead, we got him fighting Jorge Highland, Hugo Centeno Jr., Matt Korobov. And by the way, I had thought that Matt Korobov gave Jermall Charlo his toughest test. Like, I thought that Jermall Charlo lost a lot of those early rounds against Korobov. Korobov was just lining him up nicely with that straight left hand. And that fight was actually the same night that Tony Harrison won via decision over Jermall Charlo. Same night. I actually thought that those decisions were flipped. I thought that Jermall Charlo deserved a win over Tony Harrison, and that Matt Korobov either deserved a win over Jermall Charlo or it could have been a draw. It was one of those could go either way types of fights, but Jermall Charlo kind of had his hands full in that one, especially during the first half of the fight. He did come on strong, and he hurt Matt Korobov towards the end of that fight. But after that Korobov fight, or that fight against Korobov, Jermall Charlo then fights Brandon Adams, who, wasn't a well-renowned fighter at the time, but, a couple years later, he would fight and upset Bohachuk, but then hasn't returned to the ring since. That win against Bohachuk was early 2021. We haven't seen Brandon Adams since. And then Jermall Charlo fights Dennis Hogan, who isn't even really a 160 guy, and he stops Hogan in the 7th round. And then he fights Sergey Derevianchenko. So for the first time, he fights a good middleweight opponent, just like Jaime Munguia recently fought Derevianchenko, and that was, in my view, Jaime Munguia's first really good middleweight opponent. And Jermall Charlo looked more impressive against Derevianchenko than Triple G did, than Daniel Jacobs did before that, than Carlos Adames did, who also got a win over Derevianchenko, and more impressive than Jaime Munguia did against Derevianchenko. Derevianchenko has now fought like 4 guys, or you could even say 5 guys, where it's a very close fight, and 4 of those fights pretty much could have gone either way. Although I do think that Jermall Charlo and Carlos Adames won the most clearly against Derevianchenko, but Jermall Charlo won even more clearly, in my view, than Carlos Adames did. And Jermall Charlo, in that fight, it was a unanimous decision win, and he looked like the complete package. He's like jabbing super well, controlling range, able to counter punch well, and Jermall Charlo has a lot of nice knockouts with counter punches. Like, that's how he knocked Cornelius Bundridge out. That's how he knocked J. Rock Williams out. Well, in this fight against Derevianchenko, Jermall Charlo basically started to he looked like he was fulfilling a lot of the promise that he was showing in those earlier fights, earlier years. And I really thought that we were dealing with a bona fide elite middleweight by that point. Because again, this is the first time I had seen Jermall in there with a elite or near elite middleweight. Well, that fight was September 2020, and then he returns to the ring in the summer of 2021 against Juan Macias Montiel, who's been, knocked out in the early rounds against Jaime Munguia, and who most recently, or more recently than this Jermall Charlo fight, got stopped by Carlos Adames. Well, when Jermall Charlo fought Juan Montiel, as good as he looked against Derevianchenko, he looked way less sharp and way less focused against Juan Montiel. It was weird. It's like you're seeing him against somebody who is not in an elite middleweight, but the guy, to Jermall Charlo's credit, he hit Montiel with a lot of nice shots in the first couple of rounds. Maybe he punched himself out because he looked pretty spent, or at least tired and less sharp in the second half of the fight, where Montiel started to land some nice shots against Jermall Charlo, who's usually a very defensively responsible fighter, and who again is a very good technician working behind a jab, usually able to exercise distance and range control. Well, he started to look very vulnerable against Juan Montiel. And yes, he did win the fight via unanimous decision, but there were no really good takeaways after that fight. You could even see Jermall Charlo's reaction after the fight in his post-fight interview. He just, he looked like he knew that he wasn't his best, and that was not a good showing, even in a win against Montiel. Well, it turns out he's been dealing with a lot of mental health issues. He's dealt with a very traumatic divorce, and he hasn't been in the ring since that fight against Montiel in mid-2021. So, look, I don't know what we're going to get in this ring return for Jermall Charlo. No, he's not fighting an elite middleweight like Jose Benavidez Jr. was at his best at light welterweight. We're talking 140, and then at welterweight, he was pretty good. But, Jose Benavidez got shot in 2016. He was out of the ring for a couple years. He returned to the ring at welterweight, and then a couple fights later had that pretty good showing against Terrence Crawford. He didn't get stopped until the 12th round. In fact, he's taken Terrence Crawford deeper into a fight than any of Terrence Crawford's other welterweight opponents. I think Terrence Crawford has fought at welterweight like 7 or 8 times now. Jose Benavidez Jr. has been the only one to enter a 12th round against Terrence Crawford, and then Terrence Crawford stopped him in the 12th. But yeah, Jose Benavidez got shot in 2016, was out of the ring for a couple years, fought a few fights, including that fight against Crawford, and then didn't return to the ring for 3 years. So that was a 3-year absence for Jose Benavidez Jr. after he had already experienced a 2-year absence after getting shot in the leg. And since his return, Benavidez Jr. has been 1-1-1. He beat Yan Yanyan, where if you look at that fight between Benavidez and Yan Yanyan, Benavidez should have probably been disqualified in that first round. He lit Yan Yanyan up like 3 times in the back of the head with rabbit punches. Like, it was clear and it looked super blatant. Like, Yan Yanyan's head was like turned like this, And Benavidez Jr. is looking at the back of his head, hits him once, twice, and then a third time. He didn't even get a point taken away for that egregious foul. Well, that was his win, and that fight was at a 158-pound catch weight. This fight between Jermall Charlo and Benavidez is going to be at 163. So this isn't even Jermall Charlo fighting at middleweight. This is a non-title fight. It's at 163. And it's a 10-rounder. It's not even a 12-rounder. This is Jermall Charlo's first 10-round fight since 2015. That's how long and how consistently Jermall Charlo was fighting at an elite level. And that, 2015 fight was against Michael Finney. So that was before the Cornelius K9 Bundridge and the Austin Trout fight for Jermall Charlo. So this is a 10-rounder at 163. The highest Jose Benavidez Jr. has fought, as I said, was that 158 catchweight fight against Yan Yanin. His fight before that was a loss. Benavidez lost to Danny Garcia via majority decision. I thought that it should have been a unanimous decision win for Danny Garcia, but it was majority decision. And then Benavidez fought to a draw with Francisco Emmanuel Torres just before fighting Danny Garcia. So Jose Benavidez Jr., he's not an elite fighter at this point. He's a pretty good fighter. His movement, leg-wise, hasn't been the same since he got shot in 2016. He's way less mobile. You could just look at that fight against Danny Garcia and see how stationary Jose Benavidez Jr. is, especially on the back half of the fight. But he was able to beat Yan Yanin because he was able to just walk Yan Yanin down. Yan Yanin just looked outclassed. And Jose Benavidez Jr. can go to the body well. Like, he even kind of hurt. Like, as far as I saw it, I thought he hurt Terrence Crawford. Not to where you see Crawford stagger or anything, but just body language wise, just the way that he kind of took a step back. And there was just, you know how you could tell without the guy being wobbly that the guy's hurt? If you watch Crawford versus Benavidez Jr., I thought that Benavidez Jr. hurt Crawford once or twice to the body, like between the third and the fifth round, somewhere in there. But Benavidez just devastated Yan Yanin to the body. He throws like a nice sweeping left hook. He could, kind of switch stances because he's not totally, standing in a bladed stance kind of way. He kind of has his feet closer to being squared a lot of the times. And sometimes his right foot will be in front of his left, so his backhand becomes his left hand, and he could still throw that one to the body. So Benavidez Jr., he's a pretty strong fighter. He's not a very fast or snappy fighter at this point. So if Jermall Charlo was still prime Jermall Charlo, to me, this would be a no-brainer. This would be like a mismatch. Because again, Jermall Charlo at his best is super sharp. The problem is I have no idea what to expect from Jermall Charlo. Like, look, it's one thing to be out of the ring for a year. And you know what? Even before this 2.5-year layoff, he had only fought once in 2022 against Montiel. He had only fought once in 2020, largely, that was the COVID 2020 year, right? He fought once in 2020 against Derevianchenko. So even in his last two fights before this long 2.5-year layoff, he wasn't super active already. So it's one thing to be off for a year. It's another thing to be off for 2 or 2.5 years, but to be out of the ring, not because you're having like a contractual dispute, like the other two guys I'm about to mention who have kind of defied the odds when it comes to being out like multiple years or more and came back to have significantly good post-layoff stretches in their career. So Jermall Charlo wasn't out because of a contractual dispute. He was out because his mind wasn't right and he was going through a lot of stuff and he was having, as I said, mental health issues that he himself has acknowledged, and that has also turned into some ugly smack talk between he and Benavidez Jr. in their press conferences. It got pretty ugly between the two, with Benavidez mentioning Charlo's mental health issues and then Charlo referring to Benavidez being shot, and it just got pretty ugly in the smack talk. But Jermall Charlo, we really have no idea what to expect. Now, the two guys who did defy the odds, in my view, were Andre Ward, who after winning the Super 6 tournament fought and beat, he stopped Chad Dawson and beat Edwin Rodriguez, La Bamba, I think his nickname was. Remember Edwin Rodriguez? But those were Andre Ward's two fights after the Super 6 win, where he beat, Mikkel Kessler, Alan Green, Arthur Abraham, and Carl Froch. He then beat Chad Dawson and Edwin Rodriguez, and he was out of the ring for just over a year and a half. So still less than 2 years. And then that's when he campaigned at light heavyweight, ended up resulting in those back-to-back fights against Sergey the Crusher Kovalev. And the other fighter who I saw as defying the odds was Mikey Garcia in his contractual dispute after campaigning at like 126 and 130 and having a very good career, multiple division champion and all that. He took a 2.5 year layoff. So the same as Jermall Charlo basically. And then he came back and he looked like a different guy. Like he was a lot buffer. He was skinny before that 2.5 year layoff. He came back. He competed at lightweight and then 140 and 147 when he tested Errol Spence, and then fought a couple more, Jesse Vargas up at 147. But he, still had a very good stretch of his career before he took on Errol Spence. Like he beat Adrian Broner, Robert Easter Jr. He had some good wins, Sergey Lipinets. So Mikey Garcia, I see as having defied the odds in that regard. Came back after a long layoff and still had a good stretch of his career after the layoff. Jermall Charlo, I don't expect him to be nearly as sharp as he was. If anything, I think that we're going to get a performance not too dissimilar from maybe Keith Thurman after his long layoff when he came back and fought Josecito Lopez. And remember, Keith Thurman got hurt badly in those middle rounds and he ended up winning like a majority decision or split. It was a close decision win for Keith Thurman. So he did not look like the same guy who had, won back-to-back fights against prime Sean Porter and prime Danny Garcia. It wasn't the same Keith one-time Thurman. And I don't think we have ever seen that same Keith Thurman since that long layoff. So I wonder whether we're ever going to get prime Jermall Charlo again. And, when Mikey Garcia left the ring and then returned, he was younger than Jermall Charlo was when Jermall Charlo left. Jermall Charlo left at like 31 years old and is coming back at 33 years old. So look, I would be surprised if Jermall Charlo doesn't win this fight. Like that's largely why he's going against Jose Benavidez Jr. This is a very, very winnable fight for Jermall Charlo. Like this guy isn't even close to being a middleweight. Yes, he was a big 140, 147, but he's not a middleweight, doesn't hit like a middleweight. And I wonder or question whether he could absorb a lot of middleweight punches. So Jermall Charlo, I think he's still going to hit pretty hard. I'm just really curious to see what kind of a sweet science-like technician he's going to be against Jose Benavidez Jr., who I expect to be trying to walk Jermall Charlo down. Benavidez Jr. is a bit of a plodder. Like I said, he's not fleet of foot these days. So I think he's going to kind of plod forward, not too dissimilarly from Juan Macias Montiel. So this is one of those fights where I think Jermall Charlo will be able to work some of the ring rust off. And he can afford to not be as sharp as he was against Sergey Derevianchenko and still come out with the victory. I expect Jermall Charlo to win here. Is he going to stop Benavidez? Well, again, if he was prime Jermall Charlo and if he was totally sharp Jermall Charlo, I think he not only beats Benavidez, but he stops Benavidez like even in the early and middle rounds. I look at Jermall Charlo as being that good. I think this is going to go several rounds. And I think that, maybe he stops Jose Benavidez Jr. late as Jose Benavidez Jr. becomes easier and easier to hit. And Jermall Charlo, again, this is a 10-round fight, not a 12-round fight. So he's got less time to work with. I think that this one is going to go the 10-round distance. I think that Jermall Charlo is going to win, and I think he's going to win via unanimous decision. But I think it's still going to leave a lot to be desired. Like we're not going to get prime Jermall Charlo here. If we get Jermall Charlo looking as good as he's looked like in the past, I would be very surprised. And then it's like I would really be excited as to what might be next for Jermall Charlo. I just think that it's much more likely that we get a reduced version of Jermall Charlo. And I think it's actually going to take a couple fights before he looks anything near like he looked in his prime. Like, I don't think that this is just a one fight, shake off the rust, and then you're back to 100%. I think that this is going to take a bit of time, and that's assuming he ever gets back to prime Jermall Charlo. Again, he's 33 now. So we're entering the mid-30s after this fight. But yeah, I think he's going to beat Jose Benavidez Jr., but it's going to be via decision. I think he's going to start, looking better, and he's going to take control by the middle rounds. I think that he's still going to look like clearly the stronger fighter, the better technical boxer. I just don't think his timing is going to be good enough to where he just catches Benavidez with that shot that he would have caught one of his opponents with in the past and put him out with that. But if he does get a stoppage here, again, that's going to do a lot in terms of inducing excitement for future fights for Jermall Charlo. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are with Jermall Charlo versus Jose Benavidez Jr. in the comments. And who would you like to see Jermall Charlo fight if things go well for him here? It looks like the fight that they're kind of angling towards is Caleb Plant versus Jermall Charlo. Now, again, this is at 163 catchweight. I don't love that Caleb Plant fight for Jermall Charlo as it stands. He's going to have to show me that, one, he's as sharp as he used to be, and two, that his power and his skills can carry up to 168. This fight against Jose Benavidez Jr. does not prove that. I would like to see maybe one more or two more fights in pretty quick succession, not like one fight a year. I want to see like 2 fights over the course of like 8 months, something like that, to really show us that Jermall Charlo is truly back in the saddle and is going to be a bona fide fighter at 168. And I also wonder if he's going to end up coming back down to 160 to defend his title, his WBC belt, ever again. Let me know your thoughts on all that in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.